Hi, everyone. This is Aaron Larson, Executive Editor of Power Magazine, and you're listening to the Power Podcast. On today's episode, I'm joined by Eric Mayer. He's the Vice President of Clean Energy Solutions with CF Industries. So, Eric, thanks so much for joining me. Please tell a little bit about yourself and what you do with CF Industries.
Thanks, Aaron. So, the Clean Energy Solutions Group at CF Industries is primarily responsible for two things. The first is that we work on decarbonization initiatives across our production network, and the second is we work on developing markets around green hydrogen and blue ammonia and green ammonia. By background, I'm a chemical engineer. I've worked in some of CF's operating facilities for 10 or 15 years before coming and working in marketing and sales opportunities. So have a fairly broad understanding of our business and our manufacturing operations.
I did a little research leading up to this interview, and I looked back at some of the annual reports that CF Industries published. Back in 2018, the company called itself a global leader in the manufacturing and distribution of nitrogen products, serving both agriculture and industrial customers. A couple years later, in 2020, it said it was a leading global fertilizer and chemical company. This year, the company's mission is said to be to provide clean energy to feed and fuel the world sustainably. Can you talk a little bit about that evolution of going from basically a nitrogen products provider to becoming a clean energy company that's fueling sustainability?
Yeah, maybe to comment a little bit on your earlier statement. We were formed as a farming co-op in 1965, really to, provide nitrogen fertilizer to the U.S. agriculture market, and we've evolved quite a bit since then through acquisitions and expansions that we've built, and today, function to serve the nitrogen market globally with, 10 operating facilities in 4 countries, so in a pretty broad distribution network. What that's allowed us to do is really, use those products to support agriculture around the world, which has been a challenge as our world population's grown. And it's allowed, through use of nitrogen fertilizer for food yields to improve and allow the world's population to be sustainably fed. And one of the challenges that has created for us is that, we use large quantities of natural gas in the manufacturing of nitrogen fertilizer, both as a fuel and as a feedstock. And so, as public positions have changed with increased, ESG pressures around greenhouse gas emissions coming, both publicly and from investors, we took the view that, maybe it's time to do something to start trying to mitigate the business risk that exists around those carbon emissions. And so, that's supported by this general momentum to decarbonize around the world via public policy with, people looking at carbon taxes and things like that provide incentive for us to decarbonize, but also for other industries around the world to look at how they would. And I think that, as we looked at that more, it became noteworthy to CF that hydrogen is really being looked at as a key means of transporting energy around the world and fueling the world in an environment where carbon emissions aren't acceptable. And movement of hydrogen is not that simple. However, we convert large quantities of hydrogen into ammonia. Currently for the fertilizer market, but ultimately that same ammonia molecule is being looked at as an efficient way of being able to move hydrogen molecules around the world, whether they're sourced from natural gas or whether they're sourced from electrolysis. And so that really, puts the industry that we're in a unique position for large quantity of growth in the future. And so those things combined, be it, the right thing to do in respecting our investors' interests while at the same time providing growth for the company, I guess is why we are heading the direction that we're heading.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, hydrogen, I think, is a topic that everybody's talking about these days, and we've seen it. We actually started a conference last year called Hydrogen Next, which kind of gets into the whole hydrogen economy and from manufacturing to distribution to usage. I think many of our listeners understand how hydrogen can be used in combustion turbines, for example, and as a storage mechanism for energy, particularly with renewables when we talk about green hydrogen. I think a lot less is known about how it can be used as ammonia, and you talk about that it's easier to transport that way. Can you explain, is there special things that need to be done when it is in an ammonia form to make it more usable for power generation applications, or how does that process work?
Sure. And so, we convert the hydrogen into ammonia. The advantage of that is that ammonia is a liquid at moderately low temperatures, or can be stored as liquid under low pressure, similar to how like LPG is stored today. In terms of how the ammonia is used, there's two possible ways of using it. One is that the ammonia can be burned directly, and because it doesn't have a carbon atom in the molecule, when it's burned, it doesn't produce any CO2. And so, some power generators, particularly in Japan, are looking at co-firing ammonia in coal-fired plants where, they could, replace, say, 20% of the coal they would burn with ammonia and essentially reduce the coal plant's emissions by 20%. That technology is being proven in a pilot test that is relatively understood and known to work. In parallel to that, there are a number of organizations working on, combusting ammonia in a gas turbine type power application. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, I believe, has an announcement sometime in 2021 that will have a gas turbine that runs on pure ammonia by 2025. To be able to fire ammonia directly, there are some challenges that you have to deal with, and one of those may be dealt with by partially cracking the ammonia back to hydrogen. And so the technology to crack ammonia back to hydrogen exists today. It's used in a few niche applications, but just doesn't exist on a large scale. And so there's a lot of very strong technology companies that are working on scaling that up now in a way that would allow, the ammonia to be converted back to hydrogen as needed. And in a power application, you wouldn't need to convert necessarily all of it back to hydrogen, but just enough to raise the heating value of the gas so that the gas turbine functions properly based on what we understand. Of course, burning ammonia, one of the downsides is it does potentially create NOx emissions, which are regulated in most municipalities. Those can be managed somewhat by how the ammonia is combusted, and then ultimately, there are proven technologies like SCR that can be used to reduce NOx like we do in most fired applications today. And I think the last big application we're looking at is really around ammonia use for marine fuel. The marine industry uses large quantities of bunker fuel to do these transoceanic voyages, and the amount of energy required makes it impossible for them to convert to something like batteries. Some of the larger marine engine manufacturers are planning to be able to inject ammonia in replacement of carbon-based fuels almost to 100%, and they think that technology will be fully developed within the next couple of years.
I mean, when I think of marine engines, I think of, Wärtsilä and Man Energy Solutions and some of these other companies that make big machines. They would be able to run these on ammonia rather than diesel fuel or fuel oil or some other type of carbon-based fuel.
Yeah, that's right. And the engine is, fundamentally the same. It would still be a reciprocating type engine. They would just be replacing the carbon-based fuel largely with ammonia with a small amount of carbon-based fuel to achieve a certain heat of combustion, if I understand it right.
So ammonia would have a little less energy per unit of volume compared to diesel fuel or some other type of fuel oil. Is that true?
Yeah, that's true. As a liquid, you have to burn about twice as many tons of ammonia as you have to burn tons of carbon-based fuel to get the same amount of energy.
Okay. Another thing that I noticed that CF Industries is working on is some carbon dioxide dehydration and compression equipment at your Donaldsonville facility and also at Yazoo City Complex in Mississippi. And from what I understand, these are expected to allow production of blue ammonia up to 1.25 million tons annually. How do you see this playing out in the future? Obviously, carbon capture and sequestration has an energy penalty associated with it. Is there a market for blue hydrogen at present, or is this just something that you're kind of planning into the future when maybe there's a carbon pricing mechanism out there?
So, yeah, we're developing carbon capture projects at both Donaldsonville and Yazoo City. One of the things that makes that more viable for CF or ammonia producers relative to some industries is that about 2/3 of the natural gas we consume is consumed for the production of hydrogen. And so as part of that manufacturing process, we have to separate out the CO2 to remove it from the process anyway. So we have a relatively concentrated, albeit low pressure stream of CO2. And so, in order to be able to sequester that, what we have to do is compress it to a high enough pressure that it can become a liquid and then remove the water before it's injected in the pipeline and pumped in the ground. And so what that means is it can be done for a lower cost than some other emission sources. And so, with the help of the 45Q tax credit that's in place, at least in the United States, that largely offsets the cost of doing these projects. And, this is very application specific because it depends on, the length of the pipelines and other infrastructure needed, but at least in the case of those projects is more or less sufficient to make them viable. Of course, you have to have a place to send the carbon. And one of the challenges right now is developing the carbon capture wells that are needed for this purpose. We think that, enhanced oil recovery is a sort of intermediate solution or way to store the carbon at the scale that we're looking at today. But as the volumes of carbon capture requirements increase in the coming years, it's going to be critical to getting these CCS wells developed. And there's a lot of very large, entities working on this. So we're confident that'll happen. And we see, support from the current Biden administration on doing that as well. In terms of the developing market for blue hydrogen and ammonia, that's starting to evolve today. Today, you already see some demand in markets like California, for instance, under the low carbon fuel standard for blue hydrogen. And then, demand globally is developing as well. It's largely tied to, the different potential buyers, corporate objectives and ultimately public policy around the world who are going to implement programs that in some way, put a price on carbon, either as a, formal tax, perhaps like what you see in the Canada or the EU, or possibly in much less direct and mechanisms like, investor-led initiatives for large public entities or, banking rule modifications that seem to be in flux right now.
Do you see green hydrogen being part of your plan in the future? Is that something that you think CF Industries will get involved in?
We do. We have a 20 megawatt green hydrogen project that we're working on at our Donaldsonville facility right now. It's actually under construction. It'll be in service in 2023. The challenge with green hydrogen is that it's quite a bit more costly than what blue is. Because of two factors. One is, the renewable power costs relative to gas costs, and then just the capital of building the green hydrogen plant. But, in both of those areas, as no doubt many people listening know, there's a lot of development going on, and those costs are projected to come down, as well as the energy efficiencies are expected to improve, so that, we think, not in the near term, but when you're out past like 2030, at some point, it's going to become very viable. And that's why we're investing in it in Donaldsonville to start building, organizational knowledge and experience with it so that we can, participate in that market as it becomes viable.
Have you got any other clean energy initiatives going on or planned, in the future?
So we do. There's the ones that we have going on that sort of you mentioned, but those only get us partially towards our 2030 goal, which is to achieve a 25% reduction in carbon intensity by then. And so, we had a fairly large team in 2021 put together that was tasked with, identifying other opportunities for carbon reduction or emissions reductions across our organization. They came up with quite a large number of opportunities that, we're working through this year to identify which ones make sense for sort of action in the next couple of years to be able to continue our decarbonization journey. And then, secondly, as we talk with potential customers around the world, the demand scenario or supply scenario for low carbon hydrogen and ammonia is very much of a, the cart and horse paradox. There's a lot of people looking at the demand that's a couple of years out in large quantities, and, they're looking for supply. And so, as we partner with them to try to make sure that we can, look at the potential for developing supply that would align with their demand, that will probably lead towards, the development of capacity projects sometime in the future.
Well, obviously, as you're evaluating some of these clean energy projects and initiatives and trying to decide which ones to choose, you're probably coming across a lot of pretty interesting technologies and evaluating different ways that you could go forward. What's got you the most excited when you think about the next 5 to 10 years? What do you think we're going to see happen that maybe people aren't even aware of at this point?
Oh, geez, it's hard to say. I mean, we come across, between just different startup companies and the private equity firms and venture capital firms are funding lots of small entities that are working on all kinds of exciting technology to, in terms of ways of producing hydrogen or more efficient ways of producing ammonia, to ways of converting the hydrogen or the ammonia back to energy. It's hard to say like which one of them is going to be successful, but there's just so many out there. And if you really think about what the energy system is today, most people don't, they use it every day, but they don't think about it or what it means to them and the amount of infrastructure that's out there to make the energy system happen as it does. So I think it's more holistic, that it'll be remarkable, with our decarbonization objectives, to see sort of the level of asset development over the coming decades as we sort of move towards a decarbonized future, that when we're in, 2040 and we look back at where we were in, 2022 and sort of where we are in 2040, that it's going to be just amazing to see how much the world has changed.
It's certain to change one way or another. I think that's one thing that we can all be certain of, but which way it's going to go or how it's going to actually evolve is going to be interesting to see. So is there anything else that you can think of that we should talk about before we wrap up the show?
No, I think we covered everything very well. If you have anything else, happy to continue to talk. But otherwise, thanks for the opportunity to talk to you, Baron.
All right. Well, thank you for joining me again. For listeners, I've been speaking with Eric Mayer. He's the Vice President of Clean Energy Solutions at CF Industries. It's been a pleasure having you on the show, Eric, and thanks for your time.
Great. Appreciate it. Enjoy your day.